We are paid, that's all. We are God.
Hey guys! The video for today will be the part 6 of What If Naruto Traveled to the World of Harry Potter. The trust of a child is a fragile thing. Naruto becomes disenchanted with Konoha and the Sandaime Hokage when he stumbles upon the truth of who and what he is on his 8th birthday. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 25, Broken Neck Pass. Saturday, April 26, 2003, late afternoon. Konoha no Sato, Hai no Kuni. Alright, my cute little students, that's enough for today, Kakashi declared during a brief lull in the melee spar the three genin had been having. We'll be taking a C-rank mission tomorrow, so make certain you pack enough supplies and equipment for a week or two and get plenty of rest tonight. You'll then need to meet outside of the Hokage's tower at 6 sharp tomorrow morning. Hi, sensei, all three genin chirped in unison, all of them excited about the prospect of leaving the village yet again. Kakashi disappeared in a swirl of leaves 2 seconds later and the trio took off towards the Namake's apartments above the wheelhouse. The first thing they did after walking through the door was make a beeline for the nearest shower so they could wash off the sweat and grim they were covered in. Once they were clean, the three of them met back up in the kitchen to grab a snack to hold them over until supper. The trio then migrated to the living room where they spent the rest of the afternoon oiling kunai, sharpening shuriken, and making a list of those tools and supplies that needed to be replaced or restocked. After supper, the three of them would split up to pack for the mission with Naruto sending out a few clones to collect those supplies they didn't have on hand in order to save time. Naruto had just sealed 3 extra sets of his non-standard shinobi uniform into a storage scroll when a sharp knock on his bedroom door reached his ears. It's unlocked. Naruto announced loudly instead of bothering to get up and open the door to see who was there. Yes, but being unlocked does not mean it is safe to open, Takashi dryly pointed out as he stepped into the room. That should teach you not to try and prank me while I'm sleeping, Naruto retorted as he smirked at his cousin. We both know you weren't sleeping at the time, you were far too busy trying to sneak into my room so you could prank the clone I'd left in my bed as a decoy. Naruto snickered in response to the accusation but didn't bother to try and deny it, that's exactly what he had been doing at the time. Takashi let out an exasperated huff and rolled his eyes but Naruto knew his cousin was amused because he could feel his cousin's emotions. The fond smile sliding onto Takashi's face a heartbeat later only confirmed it. Once the moment of shared amusement had passed, Takashi pulled a small storage scroll out of one of the many pockets in his cloak and tossed to Naruto. That has the improved chakra suppressing ward pendant I made for you in it along with a couple of spares in case the one you are wearing is damaged or lost. Takashi explained as Naruto snagged the flying scroll out of the air. It also has a dozen of the temporary disguise seals that I designed to hide your hair, eyes, and whisker marks to prevent your father's old enemies spotting your resemblance to him when you're out of the village. The directions on how to apply and remove the seals are included. They're attuned to your chakra signature so you're the only one that can use them. Thanks, Keishi. You're welcome, Squirt, Takashi replied before he left the room. As soon as his cousin was gone, Naruto sighed and grimaced at the scroll in his hand. He was touched that Takashi went out of his way to protect him but there were times when he really hated the fact that he had to hide who he was each time he set foot out of the village. That was especially true when it came to hiding his parentage. He was proud of the fact that he was the son of the Sandaime Hokage. At least he didn't have to hide who he was when he was in the village. That would have really sucked. Letting out another sigh, Naruto pushed his dissatisfaction over the need for him to disguise himself each time he left the village out of his mind and quickly skimmed through the directions for the disguise tags before he resumed packing. He started by removing all but one of the new pendants and disguise tags from the storage scroll that Takashi had given him. One of the pendants immediately replaced the old pendant he wore around his neck out of habit while 4 more were packed amongst his supplies, 1 in his utility pouch, 1 is his first aid kit, 1 in his backpack, and the last one in a hidden pocket inside of his jacket. 4 of the disguise seals he'd pulled out were distributed similarly. The scroll holding the last spare pendant and tag and the disguise tag instructions was then tucked into his utility pouch until he could give it to Kakashi for safe keeping. The rest of the extras were promptly stored in his dresser for future use. Naruto then finished packing his spare kunai and shuriken, most of them disappearing into hidden pockets that Takashi had created in his jacket. The storage scrolls holding his camping equipment, emergency supplies, and spare clothes were then tucked into his backpack along with a box of exploding tags, a roll of wire, 2 empty storage scrolls, 2 blank scrolls, and his trap kit. When his clones returned, he'd add the storage scrolls of food and water they'd picked up from the farm, identical scrolls also being passed to his teammates by another pair of his clones. Once he finished packing, Naruto set his backpack beside the door where it would be easy to find first thing in the morning before he changed into his pajamas. He'd then make his rounds to say goodnight to everyone, a habit that he'd developed not long after he'd first started living with Takashi. It was also his way of making certain that his family was both real and safe. There were still times when he feared they would disappear on him or that he'd only dreamed them up in the first place, but that didn't happen anywhere near as often as it had in the beginning. He would crawl into bed right after he finished saying his goodnights but wouldn't fall asleep until after Takashi stuck his head through the door to check on him. His cousin's method of ensuring that he was safe and where he was supposed to be. Some kids his age would be annoyed if their parents or guardians were constantly checking on them like that, but Naruto didn't mind. He liked knowing his cousin cared enough to take the time to check on him each night. The 12-and-a-half-year-old genin would drift off to sleep just a few minutes later. It felt like he'd only just closed his eyes when he heard his alarm blaring in his ear early the next morning. Letting out a soft groan of complaint, Naruto rolled over and blindly slammed his hand down on the off switch. He then snuggled back beneath the covers with every intention of going back to sleep. Naruto would bolt out of bed a heartbeat later when he recalled that Kakashi was taking them out of the village on another C-rank mission today. The blonde would then spend the next 20 minutes rushing through his usual pre-mission morning routine, which included waking up Housei, who always slept through his alarm, taking a quick shower, pulling on a clean uniform, and double-checking his pack to make certain he hadn't forgotten anything he might need. He would then meet up with Housei and Midori in the kitchen where they found breakfast waiting for them on the table as usual. They quickly ate before they swapped packs in order to check each other's supplies. That was a routine that Kakashi had drilled into them from the moment they became a team and originally intended as a combination get-to-know-your-teammates habits exercise, and a trust-building exercise, since you could learn a lot about a person by the stuff they deemed to be essential to daily function and survival. It also took quite a bit of trust to let someone else paw through your things. Once they had confirmed that all of them had everything, they trooped out the door and took to the roofs as they made their way to the Hokage's compound where they were to meet Kakashi. Their perpetually late sensei would show up 10 minutes after 6 and the trio greeted him enthusiastically. The genin very pleased with the prospect of getting out of the village for a week or two with an added bonus of avoiding D-rank missions for the same length of time. Kakashi led them into the mission assignment room just 5 minutes later where Nara Shikaku was lazily thumbing through the most recent mission requests and ranking them, according to risk, difficulty, and priority. "Good morning, Team Kakashi, are you here to pick up a new mission or file a mission report?" The chunin on duty at the assignment desk inquired by way of greeting. "We're looking to pick up a C rank," Kakashi replied somewhat lazily. "Do you have a preference for type or destination?" "No. Is your team capable of taking a high-priority search and rescue mission?" Shikaku demanded before the chunin on duty at the assignment desk could crack open the scroll holding the older C-rank missions on file. "Yes," Kakashi replied as he turned to face the older jounin. Shikaku nodded in acknowledgement as he passed a mission scroll over to Kakashi and stated, "Good, your client is the daimyo of a no Kuni. He has sent in an urgent request for help in locating his missing daughter, Mitsuhira Keo, who herself is married to the daimyo of Mitsu no Kuni, and her small entourage." Keodano was making her yearly pilgrimage through Shu no Kuni, which separates En and Mitsu, to visit her parents when they disappeared. Their trackers were sent out to locate the small delegation, but they lost their trail in Broken Neck Pass due to a rainstorm that hit the area at some point after Keodano's group disappeared. "How long has it been since they first went missing?" "Roughly 5 days ago." "How soon can you leave?" "We're packed and ready to go now," Housei replied when Kakashi glanced at the three of them over his shoulder. "I will have a runner send out a reply to An's daimyo and let them know we have a team en route and request that they send a contact meet you in Shu no Kuni's western port of call," Shikaku stated as he gestured to one of the chunin that were lounging about the room. "Let's go," Kakashi instructed as he headed for the nearest window instead of leading them back through the building. Shikaku muttered a complaint about doors being meant to allow one to move through walls under his breath as all three genin followed their instructor through the window, but Naruto ignored it, the man tended to complain about everything. The trio would catch up to Kakashi fairly quickly as he headed straight for the gates via rooftop in order to save time by avoiding the streets. The four of them would drop down to the streets when they reached the large courtyard situated in front of the gates. They made a brief stop at the gate to check out with the Chunin on duty before they took to the trees and increased their pace. "Naruto, do you need us to stop so you can apply a henge to hide your hair?" "Nah, Onaizen finally finished the disguise tags he was working on for me and I can apply one as we go," Naruto replied as he reached into his utility pouch to grab the one he'd stored in there last night. "How many of them did you bring and how long do they last?" "I packed 4 and brought an extra one for you to hold on to just in case. And they will last as long as I need them to. Keishi and I set them up so that they have to be manually deactivated in order to prevent them from dropping unexpectedly in the middle of a mission. I left the instructions in with the extra one I have for you to hold on to." "How complex is the disguise?" Kakashi inquired as he dropped back beside Naruto to collect the spare tag and the instructions. "Fairly simple, it just changes my eye and hair color and covers up my whiskers," Naruto answered as he slapped the seal onto the back of his neck and channeled a small burst of chakra through the paper. As soon as his chakra came into contact with the seal, the paper heated up and sank into his skin while leaving behind a chakra imprint of the seal on his neck. A second pulse of chakra then activated the seal and caused the color of his hair to fade from sunshine yellow to straw yellow while his eyes turned a murky hazel. At the same time, the whisker-like birthmarks on his cheek and the disguise seal on his neck faded out of view. He then took the time to fish out the storage scroll holding the spare tag and pendant and passed it over to his sensei. "Subtle and effective," Kakashi remarked as he buttoned the storage scroll into his flak jacket. "Is it as easy to deactivate as it is to activate?" "Sort of, I just have to cup my hand over the back of my neck and channel chakra into the spot where I placed the tag until the tag resurfaces so it can be peeled off. The only thing is that I'm the only one that can use or remove them because Onaizen keyed them to my chakra signature. And each tag can only be used once." Kakashi nodded in response before he moved back up to take point while Midori and Naruto fell back behind Housei in what was known as their travel formation, the positioning designed to protect the older team in the event of an ambush since he was their squad's medic in training. The four of them would then spend the rest of the morning making their way to the nearest port in order to catch a ship to Shu no Kuni. They would reach their destination just an hour shy of noon and the 3 genin would sit on the dock and eat lunch while Kakashi arranged for their passage south. By 1 o'clock, the four of them were on a cargo ship with the coastline off to their right and the open sea to their left as the ship carried them south on the current. Over the course of the next 2.5 days, Kakashi had the 3 genin working with the ship's crew to learn everything they could about sailing a ship and navigating across empty stretches of ocean by the sun and stars. When they weren't taking lessons from the sailors, they were holed up in the small cabin they were provided with for the trip going over the information they'd been given on the mission and poring over maps of Shu no Kuni. The ship they were on would reach Shu no Kuni around mid-morning on the 30th of April and as soon as the boat had been secured to the dock, Kakashi was hustling the 3 teammates over the side. The 3 of them were then given 2 hours to explore the small city port while Kakashi hunted down their contact, in order to get more information on the last known location of the missing entourage. By silent agreement, Naruto and Midori let Housei pick their direction and the 3 of them wandered out of the port and into the city where they did a bit of window shopping. When they passed a small shop selling hand-carved wood and stone trinkets, Naruto couldn't resist buying a cherry wood carving of a 6-inch tall howling wolf for Satoshi. The younger boy adored anything and everything about wolves due to the stories that Takashi still told him about his birth father. Naruto had actually made it a habit of collecting little wolf trinkets to bring back for Satoshi each time he left the village on a mission. So far he'd brought home 6 stuffed wolf toys, each one in a different color or different position, a necklace made from old teeth, a small painting of a wolf pair, and a clay tile with a huge wolf track in the center of it. He also brought back gifts for little Aika, though he never stuck to a specific theme for her gifts. The last gift he'd gotten for her had been a stained glass window with pretty pink cherry blossoms. This time, he bought her a teak carving of a sleeping rabbit that was situated on its back in a little wooden basket and its forepaws crossed over its chest. The last thing he brought from the trinket store was a small 2-inch tall jade carving of a toad for himself. Like the gifts he always got for the children, Naruto always bought himself a little something while out of the village and he usually got himself a toad because of the summoning contract his father had held. As soon as he paid for his 3 purchases, Naruto sealed them into a storage scroll and tucked it into his backpack so that it wouldn't get lost. Housei teased him, as usual, about buying souvenirs, but Naruto teased him right back when they stopped in a candy shop so that Housei could buy a bunch of sweets. The older boy had something of a sweet tooth and loved to try new kinds of candying treats. Midori wasn't without a vice either, and as soon as Housei had paid for his new stash of goodies, the 3 of them headed to the bookstore so she could buy a map and guidebook for Shu no Kuni to add to her collection. She only ever bought maps and guides for those countries or cities they visited as a team. After Midori had sealed away her new purchases, the 3 of them wandered back in the direction of the docks so they could meet back up with Kakashi-sensei and find out if he had met up with their contact. They would find the Jounin talking to an unfamiliar man at the meeting place, and the 3 of them hung back to observe the man talking to Kakashi and to scan the immediate surroundings for any signs of trouble. Once they determined that there were no suspicious characters watching their sensei, the 3 of them approached the pair. Lost their trail near the northern entrance to Broken Neck Pass, the stranger finished as the trio came to a stop just a few feet away. We combed the entire length of the pass but found no evidence that they entered the pass. Could they have taken a different route? Kakashi inquired with a slight frown. No, Broken Neck Pass is the only way through the High Neck Mountains. The only other way to get to In no Kuni from Mitsu no Kuni is to travel by ship, but Kayodano dislikes traveling over the sea unless there is no other choice because she is prone to seasickness. Is there any chance that one of her father's or husband's enemies might have taken her hostage? It is possible but unlikely, as there was no indication that anyone was targeting Kayodano, and neither her husband nor her father has received a ransom note from a kidnapper. We did not ignore the slight possibility that an enemy of either court was behind her disappearance though, hence the reason why her father sought Konoha's aid in locating her. Are there any ruins or caves where a small force could have set up base within the pass? The only thing that one will find in the pass is the haunted ruins of Kobisaki Castle. Did you search the ruins for any sign of Kayodano or recent occupation? No. Why not? Kakashi demanded as his frown shifted into a scowl beneath his face mask, and Naruto could tell that his sensei was a little irritated that such an obvious location had not been searched. The castle ruins are haunted, and any who trespass on the Kobisaki lands perish without a trace. Kayodano's guards would not have allowed her to set foot on the path leading to the castle, and any bandits foolish enough to set up camp on the grounds would have been eaten alive by the terrible spirits that haunt the land. I see. Was there anything else you wished to ask me, Shinobi-san? Yes, do you have anything that belonged to Kayodano? I will need something with her scent on it so that we can track her. I did not bring anything of hers with me as I did not know that I would need it. Shall I send a runner to her parents and ask them to send something of hers here for you? No, it will take too long for a runner to get there and back. We'll have to make do with the information that you've already given us. If you'll excuse us now, we'll be on our way so that we can make the most of what little daylight is left. Of course, Shinobi-san, I shall remain here in case you have need of me further. Kakashi nodded in acknowledgement to the man before he turned to trio of genin and ordered, let's go. We're going to search the haunted ruins first, aren't we, Kakashi-sensei? Naruto asked as the 4 of them took to the rooftops in order to avoid the crowded streets. 9 times out of 10, haunted locations are only haunted because some criminal has taken up residence in them and subsequently chase away any potential witnesses to their illegal activities. The rest of the time, the hauntings are caused by natural phenomena or human imagination. And then there's the times when there's an actual spirit involved, sensei. Naruto pointed out as his thoughts immediately flew to the spirits that his cousin had called upon over the years in addition to his father's fixed presence. The ghosts that Takashi calls upon are a unique circumstance, and I have yet to run into a spirit that hasn't been summoned forth by your cousin, Kakashi dryly retorted, and Naruto couldn't help but snicker as he recalled how Kakashi had reacted the first time he'd seen Takashi training with Kushina and Minato's spirits. Kakashi reached out to lightly slap Naruto on the back of his head for laughing at him, but Naruto ducked at the last second. He was far too used to both of his cousins doing the same thing. Their playful demeanor would drop away as soon as they reached the edge of the port city, their minds once more back on their current mission. The 4 of them quickly fell into the same formation they had used previously the moment they left the rooftops and took to the road that would take them to Broken Neck Pass. The trees in Shu no Kuni far too small and widely spaced to travel through the tree tops like they had previously Team Kakashi would keep their pace to a steady ground-eating lope until well after sunset, and they found a sheltered clearing and set up camp. They then ate a light supper before turning in for the night. Kakashi would have them up before the sun the next morning, and after a light breakfast of fruit and beef jerky, the four of them hit the road once more. Their second day of travel would see them reaching the entrance to Broken Neck Pass near sunset, and Kakashi had them set up camp outside of the pass before he summoned all 8 of his Ninken. Naruto watched his sensei give the 8 dogs their orders before they split up into 4 pairs of 2 and disappeared into the night to search for any trace of the missing woman they had been hired to find. He and his teammates were very familiar with the small pack of Ninken. Kakashi often summoned them on those missions where they needed to track down their target. Most of the time, the dogs would stick around long enough to greet the 3 genin, except those times when they were called upon to handle a time-sensitive task, such as searching for a missing nobleman's wife. Once the Ninken had vanished in the darkening twilight, Kakashi ordered the 3 genin to eat and get some sleep. The trio didn't hesitate to comply, and within a half an hour, all 3 of them were sound asleep. One of the first things that Kakashi had taught them once their team had been formed and long before they'd taken their first mission out of the village, was the ability to drop off to sleep on command. They had also been conditioned to sleep in any number of uncomfortable positions, in hospitable terrains, or in clement weather. Their sensei's reasoning: a full night's sleep on a comfortable bed was not always obtainable on missions, and it was best they learn how to rest when and where they could while they still had the luxury of training their bodies to adapt instead of being forced to learn how to do so when their lives were on the line. They had also been taught how to function while suffering from sleep deprivation, how to snap into wakefulness with full awareness without revealing the change in their state of consciousness, and how to cat nap while appearing wide awake. Naruto actually excelled at the latter type of training because of the way that the Kyuubi's presence, and the steady influx of its chakra, constantly washed away his fatigue. It had been far harder for him to teach his body how to fall asleep on demand though, since he was usually too full of energy to sit still or empty his mind. That was especially true now that he wasn't using anywhere near as many clones in his daily training as he used to prior to his return to Konoha. Adopting Takashi's penchant for using discs for a day-long chakra control exercise helped. Only, instead of trying to work with glass discs, Naruto had taken to collecting interesting pebbles. And like Takashi's glass discs, each pebble was unique, each one a different size, shape, and texture on top of being made from different types of rocks, minerals, and ores. They were also carved with recall runes so that they could be reclaimed if they ever got lost, though Naruto couldn't actually recall them himself since he didn't have even a drop of magic. It was easy enough to ask his cousin or one of the elves to recall them for him if he needed them to, though he'd actually lost count of the number of pebbles he'd collected over the past year, as he inevitably brought home a new handful at the end of each mission, even the ones that took place in the village. He'd also lost count of the number of pebbles he held in place on a daily basis, as he didn't bother changing them out every day like his cousin did. He only ever changed the ones he was using or added to them once a week or at the end of a mission. There were a few times when he'd even showered with them in place just because of the challenge it offered. His chakra reserves were even larger than Takashi's though, and that was why he had even more problems than his cousin did when it came to chakra control and excess energy. When he'd asked why they didn't have the same amount of chakra, Jiraiya had told him it had something to do with him having had half of the Kyuubi sealed in him at birth, while Takashi had been 19 when he'd had the other half of the Kyuubi sealed into him. Apparently, the 9 extra years he'd held the Kyuubi had made a big difference when it came to how large his reserves were. On top of that, he had been born with larger than average reserves due to his Uzumaki heritage, which meant that he'd had far more chakra to start with even before he'd had the Kyuubi sealed in him. His coils were also far more flexible, which allowed his reserves to grow at a far faster rate with only a minimal risk of his chakra coils suffering from the steady influx of the Kyuubi's chakra. It was the Uzumaki's vast chakra reserves and that coil flexibility that made them ideal Jinchuriki. Magic users also made excellent containers, providing the bijou was sealed into them at birth or their magical reserves were large enough to heal the extensive damage caused by the sealing, which eliminated more than 90% of the magical population worldwide. Kakashi would wake his genin up an hour before sunrise so they could dismantle their camp and eat breakfast. As soon as they had finished eating, they headed into Broken Neck Pass at a steady lope using their sweep formation. The new formation was basically a mirror image of their travel formation, with Naruto and Midori running point along the edges of the pass, Naruto to the left and Midori to the right, Housei 10 feet behind them in the center, and Kakashi another 10 feet behind Housei where he could watch their back trail, keep an eye on all three genin, and scan for any clues they might have missed. They'd barely been traveling through the pass for 3 hours before they reached an overgrown turnoff on the right side of the pass. Seated to one side of the turnoff were Guruko and Uhei, two of Kakashi's Ninken. Both dogs looked rather nervous as they continuously swiveled their ears back and forth to audibly scan their surroundings while their eyes never stopped moving to visually catalog the immediate area. Kakashi loudly snapped his fingers, the sound enhanced with a thread of chakra, to wordlessly instruct the trio to switch formations as they turned onto the side path. Naruto sped up as he crossed the pass while Midori slowed down to fall into step 5 feet behind him, and Housei caught up so that he was 5 feet behind Midori, with Kakashi doing the same, so that he was 5 feet behind Housei, the four of them seamlessly shifting into the Spear 1 formation. As they passed the two Ninken playing sentry, Naruto could have sworn he heard Guruko let out a soft whine, but soon put the dog's obvious worry out of his mind as he focused on scanning the side trail for tracks, traps, and enemies. Another hour of travel placed them roughly halfway to the ruins, and it was at the midway point that they found another pair of Ninken waiting for them. This time it was the mismatched pair of Pakken and Buru. The reason why the two dogs were waiting for them there was quite obvious, as they were guarding the busted remains of a palanquin. The broken pieces of wood had not been in the pass for very long, the wood itself was not weathered or rotten enough to have been there for more than a week. "Did you find any trace of the missing entourage, Pakken?" Kakashi inquired as he inspected each piece of the wrecked transport while the three genin formed a loose perimeter, and kept watch for threats. "No, there have been at least 3 severe rainstorms passing through the area and the rain obliterated all tracks and any hint of a scent," the talking pug replied sourly. "How much longer are we going to be here? I don't like this place. It feels wrong and there is something seriously creepy up ahead. We stay until we find our missing Haim," Kakashi answered as he finished inspecting the wreck. "Kakashi-sensei. Nani, Naruto? There's something not right ahead of us," Naruto replied as he tried to quell the nausea he felt from the steady aura of negativity he could feel fairly close by. It's the worst thing I've ever felt, not counting Kashianai's icy fury. Can you pick out which negative emotions you are sensing? Bone-deep weariness, echoes of sheer terror, and something deeper that feels like nothing at all, like whatever it is that is feeling it is empty or numb. It's malevolent, but it doesn't feel like killing intent. "Alright, here's what we're going to do," Kakashi stated after he took a minute to analyze Naruto's assessment. The Jounin, one of the few individuals that knew about Naruto's empathy. "Pakken and Buru are going to circle the ruins from the left and I'm going to circle them from the right. We'll be searching for any signs of occupation and note alternative exit routes in case things go south. The 3 of you, in the meantime, are going to continue down the trail until you sense any hostiles, at which point you will dig in and scout. If you make it to the ruins and don't see any sign of an enemy, then you will cautiously proceed towards the ruins to search for signs of our missing Haim and the rest of her party. Naruto, you're in charge from this point forward. If at any time, the 3 of you are attacked, you are to regroup and fall back immediately and set off an emergency flare to get my attention. I fully expect all 3 of you to watch out for each other from this point forward. Any questions? No. Then let's move out." Naruto watched both the 2 dogs and his sensei disappear into the rocky cliffs that lined the trail before he returned his attention to his 2 teammates. He felt more than a little nervous about being left in charge, but the mission's parameters was rather similar to one of the training simulations that Kakashi had put the 3 of them through in the past. Each of them had been trained to lead in certain situations, and this one just happened to be Naruto's specialty because he was essentially a one-man army thanks to his clones. "We'll continue in the Spear 1 formation and follow behind an invisible shield with a small group of clones playing rear guard," Naruto stated calmly as he called up exactly 100 clones, all but 3 of which transformed into an assortment of wild animals that immediately moved up the trail, and spread out to scout for threats, before he moved to take point. Signs and sounds only from this point forward. Ikuzo. As one, the 3 genin fell back into their previous formation, minus Kakashi, and began stealthily making their way deeper into the mountains. The last 3 Kage Bunshin that he'd created fell into step behind them, the 3 clones spreading out so that they formed a line of protection behind the genin in order to guard against attacks from the rear. Chapter 26, The Kubisaki Castle. Saturday, May 2, 2003, late morning. Broken Neck Pass, High Neck Mountains. Shu no Kuni. Naruto slipped off the road and hunkered down behind a small pile of broken rocks while Midori and Housei both took cover in a ditch on the other side of the road. Less than a dozen meters in front of them, the supposedly haunted ruins of Kubasaki Castle loomed in the center of a small valley. The blonde felt more than a little uneasy due to the negative emotions he'd been feeling since entering the side pass, growing heavier with each step he'd taken into the pass. He also couldn't help but feel like he was being watched all the time. Shaking his head, Naruto buried his unease as he peered into the valley that opened up off of the road, which was more of an overgrown track they had been following. The small valley was surrounded on all sides bar the small pass through which the road passed by steep cliffs, and was mostly flat bar the small handful of scraggly trees that were scattered about the area. A cold mist clung to the ground, the thin fog swirling endlessly in the faint breezes that were funneled into the sheltered valley via the pass they just traversed. His eyes were drawn to the castle ruins next, and Naruto couldn't help but think that the castle was in far better condition than some of the buildings in Konoha, despite the fact that the building had been labeled as ruins. There was also a distinct lack of outbuildings that one would expect to find in such a remote area, such as watchtowers, guard houses, and storage sheds. He also would have expected there to be a curtain wall built across the pass in order to protect the only entrance point to the valley, though he supposed the pile of rocks he was currently hiding behind could be all that remained of said wall. Naruto bit his lip as he tore his eyes from unnaturally undamaged castle to let his gaze skim over the rest of the valley a second time. His earlier uneasiness soon returned as he finally noticed the complete lack of wildlife in the valley, his disguised clones the only thing moving beneath the swirling mist. The blonde shuddered in response to the unnatural feel of the valley and the negative emotions that seemed to be coming from nowhere and everywhere. He then turned so that he could communicate with his teammates. "Anything?" Naruto asked using the sign code that Kakashi had taught the three of them. "Nothing," Housei signed back, his older teammate looking just as uneasy as he felt. Naruto scowled in response as he returned his gaze to the creepy castle. He then cupped his hands around his mouth and let out a short series of yips that mimicked the sound a fox made when it barked. His hinged clones ghosted deeper into the mist to circle their target, the castle, in response to his signal. Once the castle had been completely surrounded, one of his clones dispelled to report back to him, and Naruto waved at his teammates to let them know the perimeter of the castle had been secured. The three of them would abandon their hiding places a heartbeat later and converged in the center of the trail as they entered the valley and carefully approached the castle. Naruto couldn't help but think that the castle certainly had the creepy haunted look-down pat between the darkened windows and swirling mist. The fact that the building seemed to be the source of the negative emotions he could sense only added to the sinister ambience that clung to the place. Hogwarts was a far cooler castle to visit, Naruto thought to himself as the three of them approached the steps leading up to the door of the castle. It was a real haunted castle too, though those ghosts weren't all that scary. "This place is just creepy." They had nearly reached the top of the stairs when Midori grabbed hold of Naruto's wrist and pointed to a small splash of bright color on the porch that was out of place, given the drab color of the castle and the overall dreary appearance of the valley. The blonde squinted at the small patch of color before he silently signaled for Midori to inspect it while he and Housei kept watch for enemies. Midori nodded and slipped up the stairs with careful steps until she reached the top. The kunoichi then crouched down to make herself less of a target, in case the bit of color was bait for a trap, and inched closer to the item. After a brief moment, she twisted around to face Naruto as she signed, "Pink silk, torn." Naruto bit his lip as he and Housei exchanged a brief glance. The scrap of silk had most likely come from Lady Kao's clothes, since the color would have faded if it had sat on the porch for any significant length of time. Actually, if it had been there for more than a day or two, then it would have been carried off by a passing bird to use in its nest. Though, the lack of wildlife in the valley meant that there might not be any birds in the area to have seen it. It was also possible that the scrap of expensive fabric had been placed there sometime in the past couple of hours as bait to draw them closer to the castle. Frowning, Naruto glanced at the splash of bright color before he glanced out over the small stretch of the valley that was visible from his perch on the second-to-last step. When he didn't catch sight of any enemies trying to sneak up on them, something his clones would have noticed in any case, he turned back to Midori and instructed, "Pin it." Midori nodded and withdrew a kunai to pin the scrap of silk to the porch so that it would be blown away by the wind. The piece of fabric could potentially give Kakashi's pack something to track if the princess's scent was still on it when their sensei joined them, if they didn't find her first. Midori's kunai would also let Kakashi know that they'd seen the small scrap and that they'd intentionally left it behind without actually touching it because they'd recognized it as a clue to the princess's whereabouts. It was a method of containment that Kakashi had taught them specifically for tracking missions. It was also a huge mistake. The moment Midori's kunai pierced the porch, a loud, pained roar had all three genin clapping their hands to their ears even as the castle shook beneath their feet. Naruto felt himself tumble backwards off the steps before something wrapped around his ankle and yanked him towards the now open door of the castle. He had a brief glimpse of both his teammates being pulled into the castle alongside of him before he felt himself being slammed into a wall. Naruto grunted in pain as his back impacted against the wall before it felt like he'd been pulled through the wall. He was dropped to the floor a moment later and let out a string of curses when his elbow hit the floor first. Eyes tearing up from the unfunny pain in his funny bone, Naruto scrambled up onto his feet and began looking for Midori and Housei to make certain they were alright. When he didn't see either of his teammates in the room with him, he panicked. The negative feelings that were pressing down on him didn't help because they were 10 times worse inside of the castle than they had been outside, and it took him several minutes before he managed to calm himself down. Once he could think straight, he glanced about the room again. The room was mostly empty bar a pair of ancient suits of samurai armor that bracketed the archway leading into the room and an odd painting of what looked like a feudal lord that was hung on the wall directly opposite the entrance. Naruto felt uneasy as he stared at the painting for a moment, his thoughts automatically going to the magical paintings he'd seen and talked to. The suits of armor, however, radiated the malevolent emptiness that he'd been sensing since they'd entered the pass leading to the Kobisaki castle. Shaking his head, Naruto pushed aside his memories of the months he'd spent in England and turned away from the rather creepy painting. He then brought his hands up to form a cross with his index and middle fingers. A few seconds later, a dozen Kage Bunshin burst into existence in a cloud of chakra smoke. As soon as the clones finished forming, he ordered them to henge into birds and spread out through the castle to search for his missing teammates. What the hell? Naruto exclaimed a heartbeat later as he literally watched the walls of the room he was in come to life and kill every single one of his clones. Dozens of slimy tentacle-like appendages lashing out at the 12 flying clones to prevent them from leaving the room. When he saw several of the tentacles heading in his direction, Naruto dug into the outer left-hand pocket of his jacket and grabbed a handful of shuriken that he flung at the slimy ropes. Each time a shuriken struck its target, another pained roar would echo through the room and the entire castle would shake. The preteen was grabbed from behind by a pair of the tentacles a moment later and he let out a cry of disgust as the slim quickly soaked through his clothes. As he felt himself being pulled backwards, Naruto dug out a kunai and cut himself free. A horrified look slipped onto his face when he was splashed with blood as the pieces of tentacle he cut off dropped away from his body while the part still attached to the wall frantically thrashed in pain before they withdrew into the wall. The castle was alive. And it had just eaten him and his teammates. Oh, hell no. Naruto bellowed angrily at the mere idea that he and his teammates were going to be eaten by some freak building. He then brought his hands back up to form the cross seal with his hands as he loudly cried, Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. This time, 50 of clones appeared in a burst of smoke, each one of them armed with a replica of the kunai he'd been holding in his hand. All 51 of the Narutos present then simultaneously yelled, Team Kakashi is nobody's lunch, Databeo. Attack! The small army of blue and orange-clad Narutos surged forward and began cutting and slashing their way out of the room. Some of them not even bothering to aim for the archway as they cut through the walls instead. Many of the clones died as the floor came alive beneath their feet, but enough of them survived that they were able to cut their way free of the room that they had been imprisoned in. The rest of the castle was no better than the room he'd ended up in though, and Naruto had to produce a second wave and third wave of clones to sustain his assault on the living castle. At some point, the blonde Jinchuriki discarded his kunai and started using his father's Rasengan to tear through the walls as he and his clones swarmed through the castle, in search of his teammates and the missing princess. All around him, the castle shuddered, shook, and shrieked as Naruto and his clones viciously lashed out time and time again at the thing that had taken his teammates, his friends from him. 3 walls later, he found himself in what should have been the entrance hall of the castle, several doorways leading deeper into the castle, a wide staircase leading higher, and a blank stretch of wall that should have held the exit. Naruto created what must have been an 8th wave of clones to join those that were still with him and watched them split up to search the rest of the castle while he approached the wall that was supposed to hold the door leading outside. He didn't even get within 10 feet of the wall before a barricade in the form of 24 white spikes pushing up from the floor slammed together with another 24 that dropped down out of the ceiling just a scant few inches from his face. It only took him a moment to realize that he was looking at a row of large, sharp teeth and that he could have been caught between them if he'd gone even one step closer. Naruto swallowed thickly as he stumbled backwards away from the death trap that had literally snapped shut in front of his face. Once he recovered from the brief scare, Naruto formed another Rasengan and attempted to smash through the house's teeth only for him to end up being blown backwards when the chakra sphere failed to scratch the giant teeth. That alone told Naruto that that wall was the way out. He was in the middle of trying to come up with another way to break through the barricade separating him from the exit when several of his clones dispelled and sent him memories of seeing Housei being sucked into the ceiling by dozens of slimy ropes. Abandoning his efforts to force his way out of the house, Naruto sped up the stairs and did his best to ignore the way the staircase twisted and swayed beneath his feet. As soon as he reached the first landing, the castle went eerily still beneath his feet and Naruto froze for a moment before he shook off his shock and made for the next flight of stairs. Halfway up that second flight of stairs, Naruto brought his hands together once more to form another 50 clones when he felt a wave of eagerness surge through the building. Anything that made a creepy, flesh-eating building eager couldn't be a good thing in Naruto's mind. Ignoring the knot of dread that had formed in his stomach, Naruto sped up as his clones fell into step beside and behind him. They hit the second flood landing a heartbeat later and half of the clones peeled off to search the second floor for any sign of Housei while the original Naruto and the rest of his clones continued upwards. Once they reached the third floor, Naruto and his clones attempted to run down the left-hand hallway instead of heading up the next flight of stairs, so he could search the rooms above where he'd last seen his teammate, when the house attacked yet again. Naruto skidded to a stop as he caught sight of white spikes, teeth, rising out of the floor. Several of his clones weren't as observant and Naruto turned a little green when the deadly barricade of teeth snapped shut on the clones and he received the memories of what it felt like to be bitten in half. Naruto slammed his fist into the wall of teeth before he was forced to jump backwards when the floor twisted under his feet to form what looked like the insides of some giant beast. He then ducked down and retreated further when several of the slimy tentacles formed from the ceiling and walls and reached for him. The castle would chase him back across the short stretch of hallway that he'd managed to cover before his path forward had been blocked. As soon as he had backed up onto the landing at the top of the stairs, the attack immediately stopped. Surprised, Naruto paused for a moment to catch his breath before he crept forward once more, the blonde thinking that the house was trying to keep him away from his teammate. He'd barely gone 3 steps before the castle launched another attack that would again stop as soon as he retreated. His attempt to head to the right of the landing produced the same results. A single attempt to go downstairs was also met with the same result while the one attempt he made to go upstairs had not met any resistance. In Naruto's mind, that meant that the castle wanted him to go upstairs. And the last thing he wanted to do was anything that the thing trying to devour his team wanted him to do. Naruto brought his hands up one more time to form the cross seal for the Kage Bunshin and focused his thoughts on how happy Midori and Housei had been when they'd received the official papers naming them as wards of the Namikaze clan. They may not share any blood but they were family and Naruto would not let some stupid, ugly, creepy-looking castle keep them. Determination filled the blonde as he stopped channeling chakra to the pebbles he had stuck to his body and redirected that chakra into his jutsu along with every ounce of chakra he could spare. Taju Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, Naruto bellowed at the top of his lungs a heartbeat later. Well over 1,000 blonde clones materialized in a giant explosion of chakra smoke, the bodies filling up the entire staircase, the third floor landing, and much of the hallway off of the third landing in either direction. The castle groaned shuddered beneath the feet of the many Narutos for several seconds before it went still, as if the living building was holding its breath. A split second later, over 2,000 orbs of pure chakra formed on both hands of each clone and the army of blondes roared out a demand to give him back his teammates, before they attacked the house en masse. The next 5 minutes were a blur in Naruto's mind as he and his clones tore the haunted castle apart instead of just cutting through the walls like they previously had. The castle tried to crush his clone army in return but there were just so many of them that its attacks had become completely ineffective except in the cases where a group of less than 15 clones were caught on the fringes. Just picking off the stragglers at the back or those rushing ahead leading edge of the army was not enough to slow, let alone stop, the mass of angry clones. At the end of those 5 minutes, the castle let out a pained groan before it exploded into smoke, and Naruto and his army of shadow clones soon found themselves stranded, close to 30 feet in the air above a stone foundation. Several feet above them, an ancient scroll that had once rested within the tallest tower of the castle was left suspended in the air when it too had been left behind by the castle. The blonde had but a split second to curse the stupid Castle of Doom for leaving them hanging like that before gravity caught hold of him and dragged him down. Naruto screamed as he twisted around in midair to see the stone foundation of what used to be a large castle rushing up towards his face as he plummeted towards the earth. All around him, his clones echoed him as they floundered in midair. Half of the clones falling alongside of him then got the bright idea to transform into birds to save themselves before they hurriedly landed below Naruto and began forming a living tower that rose rapidly into the air to prevent him from being splattered on the foundation. The blonde met them a mere 8 feet off the ground, and the tower collapsed inwards on itself as his clones began exploding into smoke from the impact. Those clones of his that had not taken the opportunity to henge into feathered forms or that tried to change too late were dispelled at the same time as they slammed into the ground just a few seconds after Naruto hit the top of the clone tower. The few clones landed on the foundation a moment later, a couple of them bursting from heavy landings while the rest survived. One clone would have the misfortune to catch the falling scroll on its head just as it was letting out a relieved sigh at surviving the fall, the poor clone dispelling with a squawk of dismay while one of its neighbors caught the scroll in his arms before it could hit the ground and shatter. A wave of exhaustion slammed into him as he settled on the stone just a few seconds later due to several hundred clones being dispelled all at the same time. The headache that followed on the heels of the clones' combined memories was nothing to sneeze at either, and Naruto groaned weakly as he curled up in a ball and clutched at his pounding head. Those of his clones that had managed to survive the ordeal spread out to protect the original and search for the others. His teammates would actually find Naruto and his clones first. Naruto! Midori cried as she forcefully pushed her way through the protective ring of clones that had surrounded the original. Are you okay, Naruto? Hurts, Naruto whimpered as he curled up tighter when his teammate inadvertently dispelled several more clones in her rush to get to him. How see I? Hurry up and get over here. Naruto's hurt. Midori bellowed, and Naruto let out a low whine in response to the way her loud voice seemed to make the pain in his head rip pierce deeper his brain. Budge up, clones, Housei ordered as he began pushing his way through the protective ring around Naruto. Go guard the princess or something. The older boy dropped down beside Naruto a moment later and began checking him over for injuries. Where are you injured, Naruto? I see lots of blood, but I'm not finding any cuts. Head. Too many, Naruto rasped out as tried to wriggle away from Housei's hands when the older boy hit a couple of his ticklish spots. Too many what? Housei inquired as he shifted his hands up to pull Naruto's hands away from his head to check for a head injury. Clones. There's nothing I do to help you with that, Housei muttered as he dropped his hands down to peel Naruto's jacket off of him before he folded it up to form a makeshift pillow that he slid under Naruto's head and neck. The older teen had been made aware of the risks involved in dispelling Kage Bunshin in large numbers after he had been designated as their team's medic. He'd also been taught how to deal with the negative backlash of dispelling too many clones, which was basically sleep it off and don't let any remaining clones be dispelled until it was safe. Go to sleep, we'll watch over you and make sure the rest of your clones aren't dispelled. Naruto complied readily enough. He'd only remained conscious as long as he had because he'd been worried about his teammates. When he finally woke up again, it was well after sunset. As soon as he opened his eyes, he discovered that he'd been moved into the tent that he and his teammates often shared on missions and tucked into his sleeping bag. He sat up gingerly and immediately regretted it as a wave of dizziness passed through him at the same times as his head began pounding once more. Hands grabbed hold of him a moment later and gently aided him back down on the bed before Kakashi instructed, "Don't move, Gaki. Your body is still recovering from your reckless stunt with your Kage Bunshin. I wasn't gonna let some dumb possessed castle eat my teammates," Naruto growled as he reopened one eye and all but glared up at his sensei. "I wasn't implying that you should have, I was merely pointing out the fact that you could have found a better way to go about getting everyone out," Kakashi dryly pointed out. "And for the record, it wasn't a possessed castle that was trying to eat you, it was a powerful summons that had been trapped in this world. You're lucky that the creature didn't take you, your teammates, and our missing princess with it when you and your clones managed to damage it enough to force it to dispel." Naruto scrunched his face up in distaste as he thought about what might have happened to him and the others if the summons that had eaten them had taken them with it. He shuddered a moment later as he imagined being trapped inside of the creature for the rest of his life. When he had first learned about summoning contracts, he thought they were kind of cool and he had been looking forward to signing the Toad contract on his 15th birthday. Jiraiya had originally offered to let him sign several months ago, but Takashi had asked him to hold off on that for at least another year. At the time, Naruto hadn't understood why his cousin had not wanted him to sign the contract yet. Now, he thought he might understand. Summonses were not just cool pets that could fight and talk, they were powerful beings that could just as easily kill you as help you. Sure, the little ones like Kakashi's Ninken seemed harmless enough, but Naruto had seen Pakken, the smallest of the pack, take down a fully grown man on his own. And he knew from stories his father had told him that some of the toads were large enough to flatten a row of houses with a single jump. The summons disguised as the creepy castle had been huge and it had been able to transform itself into a building. Hey, sensei, if the castle was a summons, then where was the summoner? Couldn't he just call the summons back to attack us again? There is always a risk that that could happen when you are facing a summoner, but in this case I don't think that is going to happen. From what your clones told me when I arrived, you and your army of clones significantly injured the creature with your attacks and it will take time for it to recover from the attack, if it lives through its injuries. I also suspect that the summoner of this particular creature is no longer amongst the living due to the fact that your clones somehow got their hands on the summoning contract, and that would only happen if the summoner discarded it or if they died. Why would someone discard a summoning contract? Aren't they really rare and valuable? They are not as rare as most people would have you believe. It is the great contracts, those that encompass an entire animal family as a whole, such as the Toad contract, that are considered rare. The minor contracts, those that are linked to a single species or specific individual, are rather common. The contract I have with my pack is a minor contract since I am only allowed to summon the 8 Ninken that I trained and not the rest of the dog clan. The contract your clones picked up was also a minor contract, for the chameleons, because they also fall under the lizard contract, which is one of the great contracts. As for why a summoner would discard a contract, there are potentially many reasons. Some summonses are seen as weak or useless because they are not all that powerful or have a very limited skill set. Then there are those summonses that demand tokens or tributes that a summoner is either incapable or unwilling to provide. And then there are instances when a summons will reject the summoner because the summoner does not meet the conditions that they require of a summoner. For example, I didn't have the chakra reserves necessary to claim the dog contract at the time I had signed it, but was still allowed to form a subcontract with the 8 individuals that make up my pack. I could probably claim the dog contract now, if I wanted to, since my reserves have more than tripled since I first signed the dog contract, but I won't because I am happy with my current pack. We've been together for years and work well together, so there is no need for me to seek out new summonses. I wonder if that is why Keishi and I told Jiraiya no when Jiraiya offered to let me sign the Toad contract back in January. Naruto mused out loud. No, your cousin refused to let you sign the contract this year because the Toad boss requires all new summoners that pass his initiation test to drink sake with him before he will accept them, Kakashi corrected. And Takashi wasn't about to allow Jiraiya to encourage you to drink alcohol before you'd even hit puberty. Guess that explains why I saw Jiraiya walking around in a pink tutu and pigtails when he finished talking with Keishi and I that day. Did you have any other questions? What's going to happen to the summoning contract that my clones found? It belongs to the Namikaze clan now, since you were the one that found it. Whether or not you sign it is up to you and your cousin. Ugh, I think I'll pass. I don't want to see that stupid castle again, Databeo. Housei or Midori can have it, if they want it. Neither one of them has the chakra reserves to sign even a minor contract right now, though it is considerate of you to think of your teammates. If one of them is interested in the chameleon contract, then they will need to build up their reserves first. That is something that they will need to discuss with Takashi first though, since he is their sponsor and the head of the Namikaze clan. Naruto shrugged his shoulders and opened his mouth to reply only for his stomach to speak up first, a low rumbling grumble filling the tent. Kakashi arched his visible eyebrow at him before he let out a soft snort of amusement, and Naruto gave him an embarrassed grin in return. Sounds like someone is mostly recovered now, Kakashi drawled a moment later. I guess that means that I had better send your little co-conspirators in with supper so they can see for themselves that you'll survive. Kakashi backed out of the tent as soon as he finished talking, and less than 8 minutes later, Midori and Housei were crowding into the tent to hug him and ply him with food. The three genin then spent the next hour sharing their separate experiences inside of the false castle. By the time they finished comparing notes, all three of them made the unanimous decision that they didn't want anything to do with the chameleon contract. They were just too creepy. Naruto even went so far as to silently declare that the chameleon clan was creepier than real ghosts. At the end of that hour, Naruto crashed again and slept through the night. When he woke up the next morning, he felt far better than he had when he'd gone to sleep, and his head no longer felt as if it was trying to bash its way out of his skull, while twirling in place. After a quick breakfast, Team Kakashi packed up and gathered up the missing princess and her entourage before they escorted their charges out of the pass. From the moment they moved out, one of Naruto's many shadow clones would dispel every 30 minutes until the last of the clones he'd created to fight the castle were gone. As soon as they cleared the pass on the morning of the 4th, Lady Kao and her people were handed over to her parents' men, and Team Kakashi headed home. Once they hit the port and booked their passage north, the three genin were given 2 hours to explore, and they bought their usual round of souvenirs before they returned to the docks and boarded the ship. They would be dropped off at a tiny little port just 5 miles north of the border between Kawa no Kuni and Hai no Kuni 2 days later, and they would leisurely make their way back to Konoha on foot, with Naruto removing the seal disguising his hair and eyes when they were nearly home. The four of them would stroll through the main gate of Konoha around supper time on the 10th of May and head straight to the Hokage's tower to report the successful completion of their mission. The news that they had taken possession of a minor summoning contract during the mission would see their team being awarded a tidy little pay bonus for bringing a new contract into the village. At the end of their debriefing, Team Kakashi would be given 7 days off to recoup from the mission, and Naruto was ordered to present himself to Tsunade first thing in the morning for a medical checkup. I still don't see why I have to have a stupid checkup, Naruto grumbled under his breath as he followed Housei and Midori out of the mission room while Kakashi disappeared through the nearest window. I mean, it's not like there's anything wrong with me now. His teammates merely rolled their eyes and ignored his whining. They were long used to hearing him complain any time he was ordered to see a medic for any reason. They were just exiting the tower when Naruto was plowed into by a small boy several years older than Satoshi, wearing a bright yellow shirt with the Konoha leaf on the front, a long blue scarf, and a white helmet with an angry smiley face on one side, a small red dot on the other, and a hole through which his brown hair stuck out. The poor kid bounced off Naruto and landed on his butt when Naruto automatically stuck his feet to the ground with chakra to keep from being knocked off his feet. Long used to being tackled by his Otuto, which was why he'd taken to using chakra to stick his feet to the ground when he was bumped into, Naruto simply sighed as he reached down and lifted the kid back up onto his feet by the back of his shirt as he drawled out, "Oi, keep your eyes open if you're going to run about like you own the place, pipsqueak. Not all of the brick walls you run into around here will be nice enough to pick you back up and dust you off." Housei snorted in amusement as he commented, "What is it with you and snot-nosed Gaki crashing into you? I swear, every time we step through a door there is someone trying to tackle you. That's because my Otuto is far too predictable and you refuse to step into the apartment first," Naruto retorted as he stepped around the bewildered boy that had run into him as the three genin continued on their way. "Otherwise you would be the one being tackled once in a while, and get in the way of Satoshi-kun greeting you after we've been gone for days." "I don't think so. The Gaki's like a leech once he grabs hold of a body." All three teammates laughed fondly at the very apt description of the young metamorphmagus. Satoshi tended to get a little clingy when Naruto and Takashi returned from their longer missions. Naruto really didn't mind though. He loved being hugged by his family. It reminded him that he was no longer alone. They were just drawing close to the small curtain wall that enclosed the Hokage's compound when Naruto reached out to latch onto the two teens as he exclaimed, "Come on, let's hurry up and get home. I want to take a shower before we hit Ichiraku's for ramen. It's been far too long since I've eaten the food of the gods, Databeo." If the three genin had bothered to turn around before they broke into a run and took to the rooftops, they would have seen the kid that had run into Naruto gaping after them in shock over the fact that Naruto had both admonished him and not apologized for being in the way, while the other two had not really acknowledged him at all. Chapter 27, The Hokage's Grandson. Saturday, May 10, 2003, early evening. Konoha Gakure no Sato, Hai no Kuni. 8-year-old Sarutobi Konohamaru, or as most of the village called him, Honorable Grandson, was the only grandson of the Sandaime Hokage. He was also an orphan, His mother had died from injuries she had received during a kidnapping attempt 2 hours after she'd given birth to him, and his father, the Sandaime's oldest son, had died on a mission just 2 months later. Due to how busy his grandfather was running the village and the fact that his Ojizan, Sarutobi Asuma, his father's Otuto, had only recently returned to Konoha, meant that he had been raised by nannies. Through the years, he'd had no less than 8 nannies, each and every one of them trained shinobi. The reason why he was not being raised by civilians was due to the kidnapping attempts from people looking to hurt his grandfather or use him as leverage to make his Ojizan dance to their tune. Out of those 8 babysitters, only 2 of them were still alive. One of them was his current minder, and the other one had been permanently crippled less than a year ago when there had been yet another failed attempt to steal him away from his bed. Once Konohamaru was old enough to understand that his nannies were more guards than guardians, right around his 6th birthday, he'd begun to resent their presence. Oh, most of them had been nice to him and they had been rather good at their job. No one had ever managed to get their hands on him, after all, but he hated the way they smothered him. He also hated the fact that they were not his family and that they refused to call him by his name. The 8-year-old was still young enough that he didn't quite understand why his grandfather couldn't take care of him. He knew his grandfather was the Hokage and that running the village took a lot of work, or so he'd been told, but that didn't tell him why his only family couldn't spend time with him. Konohamaru had latched onto the idea of becoming Hokage in place of his grandfather shortly after his 7th birthday so that he could make the rules and make his grandfather spend lots and lots of time with him instead of holed up in his office with mountains of boring paperwork. And as soon as the hat was his, he was going to order everyone to never call him honorable grandson again. Ever since the day he swore to take the hat from his grandfather, Konohamaru had plotted, planned, and executed well over 1,000 attacks upon his grandfather. Many of them had been carried out within hours of each other, but some of them had taken him weeks to plan and set up. So far, none of his attempts had been successful, though. Tonight, when his grandfather had been late for supper, again, Konohamaru had set into motion his next attempt to take the hat when his plan had been derailed before he even made it inside of the Hokage's tower. He'd been all set to sneak into the tower through the main entrance after he'd given Ebisu, his current nanny guard / supposed elite trainer, the slip, but he'd slammed into a brick wall the moment he tried to run inside. He'd promptly bounced back and fallen on his butt when the wall hadn't even had the decency to stumble backwards. Said brick wall had then manhandled him. Dared to pick him up by the back of his shirt. And he'd called Konohamaru a pipsqueak. Him, the honorable grandson, a pipsqueak. Konohamaru had been all set to take his attacker down until he looked up and found himself staring up at a blonde-haired boy that couldn't be more than 3 or 4 years older than him. It was the shiny Hitayate boldly displayed on the boy's forehead that had stolen his tongue though. The brick wall he'd run into had been a shinobi. And a kid. It boggled the mind. One of his grandfather's shinobi had manhandled him and called him a pipsqueak. And then he had walked off without apologizing for being in his, Konohamaru's, way. The other boy with him had even dared to call him, the Hokage's favorite, only, grandson, a snot-nosed gaki. All thoughts of ambushing his grandfather and forcing him to come home for supper, after handing over the hat to Konohamaru, naturally, had fled as he watched the trio of young shinobi walk away from him without another word. They hadn't even given him a second look once the blonde had stepped around him. And aside from the strange wordy admonishment for him to watch where he was going, those shinobi hadn't really even spoken to him. For one blessed moment, Konohamaru had known what it was like to be normal and insignificant. As he watched, the 3 shinobi, kids like him, even if they were older, left the Hokage's compound and leapt up onto the nearest roof before they disappeared in the blink of an eye. Stars filled Konohamaru's eyes. Those shinobi had been so cool. Especially the brick wall. He just had to know who they were. It had taken Konohamaru the rest of Saturday and all of Sunday to put together a plan to find out the name of the blonde brick wall. Once he had a plan, it took him all of 5 minutes to sweet-talk his Ojizan into squealing like a stuck pig. All he had to do was threaten to tell his uncle's, not girlfriend, that he'd seen him chatting up another kunoichi on his lunch break while she was out on a mission. And it was even true, though, the kunoichi he'd been chatting up had been the Hokage's secretary and Asuma Aji had merely been trying to get her to let him in to see Gigi, without an appointment. That didn't mean his laid-back uncle wanted to deal with the hassle of trying to explain that to his not-girlfriend. Konohamaru conveniently overlooked the fact that the information he was seeking wasn't actually classified and that his uncle had been amused, and not terrified, by his threat. His uncle had also been curious as to why the 8-year-old had suddenly been so keen on learning the name of a certain blonde-haired, blue-eyed, bewhiskered genin. Konohamaru didn't really care that Asuma had only been playing along with him to satisfy his curiosity. He had a name. Namikaze Naruto. Now, Konohamaru wasn't stupid. He knew all about the Namikaze clan. Everyone knew about the Namikaze clan. The return of the prestigious clan with ties to the Sandaime Hokage had been big news. Still was big news, actually. The 8-year-old just hadn't been all that interested in them because the clan's return had taken his grandfather's precious time and attention away from Konohamaru. It had therefore surprised Konohamaru that the son of his grandfather's late successor was the brick wall that had stood in his way the other day. At the same time, Konohamaru only felt it was appropriate that the first shinobi to acknowledge his, Konohamaru's, ordinariness was the honorable son of the late Konoha no Kiroi Senko. Who else could truly understand Konohamaru's plight but another boy raised under the shadow of the formidable hat? It was a rather simplistic view, but give the kid a break, he was only 8. Almost 9, if you asked him. His birthday was only 6 months away, after all. Armed with a name and a starting point, the Namikaze wheelhouse, to find his adversary, Konohamaru spent the rest of Sunday night packing his mission pack and making plans. The moment his classes at the academy had ended on Monday afternoon, the industrious 8-year-old had bolted home to put his plan into action. The first step of his little plan required him to bait his fishing pole with his grandfather's gold edition of Ika Ika Arts, the collection of Ika Ika models. The second step had been to distract Ebisu by dangling said bait in front of the closet pervert's nose to distract the man so that Konohamaru could sneak out. Once his nanny guard was preoccupied, Konohamaru slipped out the back door, snuck across the courtyard of the Hokage compound, and hurried out into the village proper with an amused, and unseen, ANBU guard in tow. Monday, May 12, 2003, mid-afternoon. Konoha no Sato, Hai no Kuni, 22-year-old Uchiha Shisui, aka Shunshin no Shisui and ANBU code name Kawauso, smirked to himself as he trailed the Hokage's grandson out of the Hokage's compound. The little twerp was certainly entertaining. He could also be rather creative when he put his mind to it. Shisui was certain the little gaki would grow up to be a right proper little prankster if he didn't break under the stress of living in his grandfather's shadow. And if Shisui had subtly encouraged and nurtured the little gaki's efforts, well, the Hokage wasn't likely to complain when said encouragements only increased the kid's chances of surviving to see his next birthday each year. Half an hour after sneaking out of the Hokage's compound, Shisui watched as his charge hunkered down in the middle of a flower bush right beside the staircase that led to the private apartments above the Namikaze wheelhouse. The elite Jounin barely suppressed the urge to palm his face when he realized the Hokage's grandson was staking the place out for some absurd reason. The kid could not have picked a worse family to spy on. The volatile head of the Namikaze clan had quickly earned a reputation for being intolerant of those that targeted his family for any reason. As he took up a perch on the roof of the Namikaze restaurant, so that he could quickly drop down to extract his charge if necessary, Shisui noticed one of the highly intelligent and half-feral cats that belonged to the Yandaime's clan slink up to the bush where Konohamaru was hiding. A feeling of impending doom filled Shisui. Those damn cats were not mere pets, no matter what the Namikaze family claimed. As the member of a clan that worked closely with shinobi-trained felines, he knew a ninken when he saw one. Shisui was just seconds away from using the Shunshin no Jutsu to swoop in and rescue the youngest Sarutobi when the cat sneezed out a laugh and sauntered away with its tail tip wriggling in obvious amusement. Bemused, Shisui relaxed when he realized that the cat had just categorized his charge as not a threat, something that he only recognized due to his clan's long-time association with the cat clan, by virtue of their ownership of the feline summoning contract. He was still worried that the Hokage's grandson was going to get himself in trouble, but he no longer thought there was a chance that his charge might be mistaken for a true threat. The masked shinobi was just settling in to watch Konohamaru watch the staircase when he caught sight of Namikaze Takashi strolling around the corner. Letting out a soft sigh of resignation, Shisui prepared himself to intervene when the dark-haired shinobi Chunin slowed to a stop a scant 3 yards away from Konohamaru's hiding place in order to stare at the pair of sandals that were peeking out from the base of the bush. As his Sharingan blazed to life, Namikaze snapped his eyes upwards to briefly meet Shisui's gaze through his porcelain mask. The slightly older man then let out a thoughtful hum before he resumed walking. Shisui tensed the moment the man drew even with the bush where the 8-year-old was hiding but remained where he was when the man merely continued past the shrub without giving the hidden child another glance. Shisui reluctantly let go of his Sharingan as soon as Namikaze was halfway up the staircase since it was obvious that the man wasn't going to do anything to Konohamaru. The man was just passing directly beneath Shisui's perch a moment later when his voice floated up to the on-duty ANBU guard. You know, I do believe that the azaleas are looking a little dry. As if the phrase was a trigger, the sprinkler system installed in the flower beds below sprang to life and drenched the young Sarutobi from head to toe before they shut off again. Shisui let out a soft snort of amusement when he got a brief glimpse of the smirk on Namikaze's face just before the man disappeared inside of his apartment. Down on the ground, a soaked Konohamaru crawled out of his hiding place looking something like a drowned kitten. If not for the man's soft words, Shisui might have thought the impromptu shower mere coincidence instead of the prank it actually was. Konohamaru shook his head to get rid of the excess water before he attempted to wring the water from his clothes. The 8-year-old then sent a determined glare at the Namikaze apartment before he moved to hide under the stairs, the kid entirely unwilling to give up his stakeout. Shisui had to give the kid props for sheer stubbornness. He was not the type of gaki to be easily deterred by a simple prank. Of course, that only made Shisui curious about why his charge felt the need to spy on the Namikaze family in the first place. As far as he was aware, the Hokage's grandson had not had any contact with the family since they had arrived in Konoha almost 2 years ago. And Shisui should know, he'd been assigned as one of the gaki's unseen guards for 2.5 years ago, officially assigned to Konohamaru's protection detail on the kid's 6th birthday a mere 2 days after an assassination attempt on the child had been foiled by the boy's nanny and previous guard. The 22-year-old would receive a partial answer some 18 minutes later when Namikaze Naruto, formerly Uzumaki Naruto, exited the apartment with the young Namikaze Satoshi happily perched on his shoulders. Like his cousin, Naruto quickly noticed the presence of both Shisui and the poorly hidden Konohamaru. Only the genin didn't bother to prank the hidden 8-year-old. No, the bewhiskered blonde had the little gaki perched on his shoulders do that, the miniature blonde with green eyes dropping a paint-filled balloon through the stairs. Naruto had then given his little passenger a high five before he bounded the rest of the way down the stairs and headed off towards the newly built Namikaze estate, the 5-year-old on his shoulders shrieking in laughter. Konohamaru had crept out from under the stairs coated in bright pink paint and Shisui had to smother his snickers of amusement lest he give away his presence to his charge. The kid wiped his face clear of paint a moment later before he took off after the two blondes, a look of fierce determination on his face. Shisui easily kept pace with his charge from the rooftops while his thoughts turned to the past. Uchiha Shisui was the youngest son of Uchiha Kagami and his second wife, Uchiha Junko. He had 2 older half-brothers, Obito and Inabi. As the baby of the family, Shisui had been doted on by his parents and Obito, but Inabi had resented both of the younger boys. Obito because their mother had died giving birth to him and Shisui just because their father had married Shisui's mother just 2 months after their mother had died. Inabi would only grow colder towards Shisui when it became obvious that the youngest brother had inherited all of their father's talent. Inabi, on the other hand, was an all-around average Uchiha. He had graduated from the academy around the middle of the class at age 8, awakened his Sharingan at age 10, and promoted to Chunin at age 17 with no hope of ever achieving a higher rank. By contrast, Shisui had graduated at the top of his class at age 6, awakened his Sharingan a month shy of his 8th birthday, awakened the Manjikyu Sharingan at age 9, during the Kyuubi's attack, promoted to Chunin at age 11, promoted to Jounin at age 12, and inducted into the ANBU Corps at 14. On top of that, Shisui had earned himself the nickname Shunshin no Shisui for his Kage-level mastery over the Shunshin no Jutsu and had a reputation as a highly skilled Genjutsu user. Inabi, on the other hand, had not earned any special titles or recognition and had been shunted into the Konoha police force the day after he'd earned his flak jacket. Of course, part of the reason why Shisui grew so fast was because the Third Great Shinobi War had erupted before he turned 3 and all of Konoha's children were pushed, especially those that showed any talent. Shisui's middle brother had not done as well under the pressure. The general consensus of the clan was that Obito was a failure who had graduated at the bottom of his class at age 10, was promoted to Chunin, by sheer dumb luck, according to Inabi, and awakened his Sharingan at age 12. Died shortly after awakening his Sharingan and broke clan law by gifting a Sharingan eye to a non-Uchiha teammate. Inabi had sneered and proclaimed their brother worthless, but Shisui had been proud to call Obito his brother and had greatly admired him. Sure, the older boy had been something of a klutz and he was always late to everything, but he'd had a heart of gold and a proper sense of humor, something most Uchiha seemed to lack. Obito saw the good in everyone, even those who tended to act like jerks, like Inabi. He'd also had a soft spot for the elderly, young children, and pets. Especially cats. Obito had always been obsessed with cats and the goofball would have just loved the Namake's cats. The cats, in turn, had loved Obito and they had followed him everywhere. If he had lived, Shisui was certain that his favorite brother would have eventually signed the feline contract the moment he had the chakra reserves to handle the contract. Even if he couldn't sign the great contract, Obito probably would have settled for a minor contract with the cats just for the privilege of having cats he could call his own. If not for Inabi being allergic to cat dander, Obito probably would have brought home every single stray he ran across. Shisui still fed the strays that lived on the clan's estate in honor of his brother. Shisui had also done his level best to fill his brother's shoes when it came to protecting their younger cousins the same way that Obito had once protected him. Those had been some pretty big shoes to fill though, and Shisui eventually ended up sharing them with Itachi. There were times when Shisui felt as if he'd failed both his brother and his cousin. If he'd been stronger and smarter, then maybe Itachi wouldn't have been forced to take up the mantle of Uchiha clan head at the tender age of 14. Pushing away the guilt he still felt over what he considered his greatest failure, Shisui took the time to ensure that there were no threats approaching his charge, who was still trailing after the Namake's pair, before he allowed his thoughts to drift back to his older memories. Shisui was not ashamed to admit that he had bawled his eyes out the day he'd learned of Obito's death. It was as if someone had ripped the sun out of the sky and Shisui couldn't stand the Obito-shaped hole that had been torn out of his heart. The loss of his favorite brother had cut so deeply that there were still days when he felt like he couldn't breathe, though those days didn't come as often as they once had. Obito's death had also broken something in their father, and while he didn't seek death, he also didn't live anymore. His mother had tried to keep Kagami grounded, but as much as he knew his father had loved his mother, his father had loved Obito and Inabi's mother first, and Obito had been part of his first wife. Uchiha Akemi had died bringing Obito into this world, and losing him had meant that their father had lost another piece of his first love. That Inabi had been steadily growing further apart from their little family had only made things worse because it meant that their father was losing the last link to Akemi. It was the pain that Inabi caused to their father that made Shisui grow resentful of his oldest brother. Well, that and the insults that the team had heaped upon Obito both before and after his death. Inabi's decision to side with Fugaku on the matter of Obito's surviving Sharingan, which had been transplanted into his teammate, hadn't exactly endeared him to Shisui, either. Unlike most of the clan, and Fugaku, the Uchiha clan head at the time, in particular, Shisui had been thrilled to learn that Hatake Kakashi had been given one of his brother's eyes because it meant a part of his brother still lived. It meant that his favorite brother could still see him, and Shisui embraced his inner prankster in his brother's honor so that Obito would know he hadn't been forgotten and that he was missed. Once he'd awakened his own Sharingan, just a few weeks after Obito's death, Shisui had secretly helped Kakashi train his second-hand Sharingan, meticulously copying all of the Sharingan scrolls for the older boy. If he had been caught, he would have been harshly punished by the clan, but his father had shielded him from discovery and provided him with appropriate training material to pass along. Kakashi had in turn taught Shisui a number of jutsu that he'd been taught or that he would later copy through his Sharingan out of gratitude for much-needed training. The war had ended not long after Obito's death, but the village remained uneasy and tense for several months longer. The Sandaime Hokage was sworn in about the same time, and the charismatic Jounin had soon lifted the village out of its depression. For 2 years the Konoha had thrived beneath the leadership of Namake's Minato, and a grudging peace had settled over the elemental nations. And then their world had been torn asunder when the Kyuubi had attacked the village out of the blue. If losing Obito had ripped a hole in Shisui's heart, the night of the Kyuubi's attack had gouged out pieces of his soul. So many people had died that night and over the course of the next 2 or 3 months. A number of them people he'd been close to. His father had died trying to stall the Kyuubi so that the civilians could be evacuated. His mother had died of chakra poisoning a week after the attack. His Kunoichi teammate had been crushed beneath an apartment complex when one of the Kyuubi's tails had struck the building just as they were running past it on their way to the emergency shelters behind the Hokage's monument. Shisui had pulled his other teammate out of the way in time to save him, but Yamanaka Inoko had tripped over a piece of rubble and her hand had been torn from his. Shisue's eyes had burned when he turned around in time to see Inoko's pupilless blue eyes fill with terror seconds before she had disappeared beneath a wall of concrete. He probably would have died that night as well if not for his other teammate, an orphan by the name of Mitate, dragging him to the shelters. He would later learn that he developed the Manjikyu Sharingan as a result of his belief that it had been his fault that his teammate had died. Fugaku had been thrilled over the development when Inabi had told their older cousin, his oldest brother, jealous of the fact that Shisui had once again surpassed him. Shisui had been horrified once he had learned that the man, and a good portion of their entire clan, was pleased that he, Shisui, had profited from his teammate's tragic death. The crushing guilt he felt over his failure to save Inoko was what pushed Shisui grow stronger, and faster, so that he'd never again have to watch someone precious to him die. And he still hadn't been good enough to prevent the clan from tearing itself apart in another man's useless bid for power that would have destroyed the village. Shaking his head in irritation, Shisui once again pushed away his memories of the failed Uchiha coup so he wouldn't have to remember the hate he'd seen in Inabi's eyes when he'd killed his brother to save Itachi. Keeping his mind firmly on the present, Shisui focused half of his attention on the unfolding drama below as the two Namikaze boys finally confronted their stalker just outside of the Namikaze estate. The rest of his attention was on the immediate surroundings since this part of the village had significantly less traffic than most other sections, though that was slowly changing thanks to the Namikaze clan building their new estate there. "Is there something I can help you with, Pipsqueak?" Naruto asked in an exasperated tone as he swung the younger blonde off of his shoulders. "How did you do it?" Konohamaru demanded, and Shisui nearly winced beneath his mask when he heard the sheer level of desperation in the 8-year-old's voice. "How did I do what?" "Fill the balloon with paint." "That was easy, I used a funnel." "No, not that, I already knew how to make my own paint bombs." "Then what? How do you make them see you?" "You're the son of a Hokage, but they don't call you honorable son. They know your name and they see you instead of the yondaime." "Please. I have to know how to make them see me before I forget my own name because people won't stop calling me honorable grandson." Shisui swore the bewhiskered blonde aged decades by the time Konohamaru had finished pleading with him. Hell, even Shisui felt older than he was after hearing the raw pain in his charge's voice. "Ignore them. Huh. Ignore the people that call you names you don't like to be called. It doesn't matter if they are calling you Honorable Gaki or if they are calling you Dobe, ignore them all. When they start turning blue in the face because you won't listen to them, tell them your name. Don't yell at them though, that never works. They'll just call it a temper tantrum and ignore you instead. If that still doesn't work, you can always try the Namikaze approach." "What's the Namikaze approach?" "Prank them till they bawl like babies," Naruto replied with a smirk, and Shisui felt amusement bubble up inside of him as he recalled the descriptions of some of the pranks that Naruto had pulled both before he disappeared and after he had returned with his cousins in tow. If those two teamed up, the Hokage wouldn't know what hit him. "Naruto and Ii's pranks are the bestest. They're second only to my Otusan's pranks," Satoshi chimed in from where he was clinging to the older blonde's left leg. "That's only because Keishi and II cheats," Naruto groused before he picked the younger boy up and held him upside down with one arm while tickling his stomach with his free hand. "Oyabun," Konohamaru gushed as stars of admiration formed in his eyes. "Teach me." "I don't know, what do you think, Satoshi? Should we teach this nameless Pipsqueak the proper way to prank?" "Are you sure we should, Niken? He looks awful girly covered in pink paint like that." "That's because you dropped a paint bomb on me," Konohamaru yelled as he visibly twitched in annoyance over being called girly by the 5-year-old. "We could always test him," Naruto suggested in a thoughtful tone. "Test? What kind of test?" The two Namikaze exchanged a single glance before Naruto smirked at Konohamaru and replied, "We'll play a little game of tag, and if you can catch both of us, then I'll teach you one of my favorite pranks." "Yosh! I'll catch you both no problem, I'm the fastest kid in my class." "Alright, what's your favorite color?" "Blue, why?" "I hope you have good aim," Naruto stated as he pulled a large bag of blue balloons out of his jacket pocket that he handed to Konohamaru, and Shisui did a double take as he tried to figure out how the Gaki had fit that bag in a small pocket. It hadn't been a storage seal, there had been no flare of chakra as he pulled out the bag. Frowning at the blonde, he watched as Naruto pulled an orange balloon from a different pocket and promptly broke it over Konohamaru's head. "Tag, you're it, Pipsqueak." Naruto and Satoshi both laughed manically in response to the prank before they split up and took off running. Orange paint dripped down over Konohamaru's head as the 8-year-old stood unmoving for a long minute before he let out a war cry and took off after Naruto with a blue balloon in each hand. Shisui didn't bother trying to silence the small laugh that slipped through his lips in response to the way Naruto had goaded Konohamaru into losing his temper. He would laugh several more times over the course of the next 2 hours as the three boys waged war against one another with the paint-filled balloons that two Namikaze Gaki kept pulling out of their clothes. By the time they had worn themselves out, all three of them were covered in a mess of pink, orange, and blue paint. They were also grinning widely and Shisui couldn't remember the last time he'd seen Konohamaru that happy. He started smirking a moment later as it occurred to him that Konohamaru's pranks were probably going to show a marked increase in both effectiveness and originality. His heart ached for a brief moment as he thought about how much Obito would have loved to have witnessed this moment. Hell, Obito probably would have been right in the thick of it. Shisui's thoughts were pulled away from his absent brother when he sensed someone approaching the small clearing where the three boys were practically asleep. Half a minute later, Namikaze stepped into view and Shisui watched as the Chunin paused to pull a camera out of his pocket so he could snap a picture of the trio. He then tucked the camera away and did something with one of his daggers that drew the paint from the youngest Namikaze, formed it into a large ball, and turned it green before it was promptly dropped onto Naruto. Namikaze then put away his dagger, picked up his son, and wandered out of the clearing whistling a jaunty tune while Naruto loudly called him a cheater. Namikaze's laughter drifted back on the wind a moment later. Can we prank him back? Konohamaru asked as he eyed the globs of green paint that had hit him due to how close he'd been to Naruto when the older boy had been tagged by his cousin. Most definitely, Pipsqueak. I'm not a Pipsqueak. Well, what else am I supposed to call you? It's not like you ever introduced yourself. I'm Sarutobi Konohamaru and I'm going to be the next Hokage just as soon as I can take the hat from Gigi. Yeah, that brings back a lot of memories, Databeo. I used to want to be the Hokage too. What do you mean used to? Why wouldn't you want to be the Hokage anymore? I'm far too young to face the greatest evil in the world. Nanny. What are you talking about? One word, paperwork. There is nothing more evil than having to face endless piles of paperwork that always threaten to bury you alive. Paperwork really is evil, it keeps Gigi from spending time with me, Konohamaru sadly agreed. He's always missing supper because he's always working late. So, do something about it. What do you mean? If the evil paperwork is keeping him from his supper, then pack up his supper and take it to him. Make a picnic out of it and then you'd get to spend time with him while he eats and he gets a short break from his paperwork. That's perfect, Oyabun. Konohamaru proclaimed as he tackled the blonde. Can I come play with you and your brother again after I finish my classes tomorrow? Sure. Would it be alright if I bring my friends? Sure, we can even drag my teammates along and have a proper paint war next time. Yosh! Shisui mentally snorted in amusement over the fast friendship the two boys had formed over a single afternoon as Ebisu finally turned up to drag Konohamaru back to the Hokage's compound. As he trailed after his charge, Shisui tuned out the lecture that the older Jounin was trying to give the 8-year-old about the dangers of running off. It was a lecture that Ebisu had given the kid at least once a week since the day he'd been assigned as Konohamaru's guard and Shisui wondered why the man never tried to approach the matter from a different direction since it obviously wasn't working. Shisui dismissed that line of thinking a moment later as they reached the busier street so that he could focus on not losing sight of his charge as Ebisu dragged the boy home. That's it for part 6. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.